kommt sie in meine Richtung irgendwo und dann suchen wir uns an. Ich habe auch keine Idee, was das funktioniert. Hier. Eigene Pizza machen die. Kann man das irgendwo? Ohne. Ich kann einfach zu dir kommen oder sagen, wenn die loslaufen, wir treffen uns irgendwo oder. Ja, schick mal als SMS. Ja, mach mal. Ich habe nichts zum Schreiben in meinem Mund. Oder? Ja, natürlich. Alles gleich, ich gehe kurz an, wenn ich fertig bin. Bis gleich. Tschüss. What's the plan? Do we need to like so?
Yeah, like
Yeah. Oh.
If you want to grab those chairs, that would be
Put a few.
Yeah. Back there. Yeah. Hello, Chris.
Hey, how you doing?
Oh, really well. Really well. Running around and you know.
What are you doing these days? As little as I can. It feels so nice. I'm always trying it. Yeah. I end up doing stuff anyway. Yep. Just relaxing, huh? Trying to cool. That's good. And it works. Oh,
It's showing this work. It's getting good. Yeah. There was a couple of weeks there where animating moves on but I've spent the last 10 years on full films. And now suddenly I have the noticeability what's going on. Right?
yes.
Almost forgot.
That's what we do, yeah.
Because you worked at work.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's taken a while since
And you can-
Plenty of time.
Yeah, well, you can connect directly to the screen using that Solstice thing.
How does it work again?
You install Solstice, if you don't have it installed, you got to reconnect and download it.
No, that might take me more than 6 minutes, but I'm gonna go.
Yeah, or there's HDMI.
Well, you don't mind, I'm gonna use
I'm getting lots of work.
HDMI stick here, because I know that's gonna work. Yeah, it's gonna work.
Then you got my attention with the Latin.
Sorry.
With what?
The Latin?
Oh, yes. Well, I aim to please.
Huh?
I aim to please.
Well, you got my attention.
So let's throw out some more like caveat emptor.
Everything goes like always.
Okay, caveat emptor means purchaser beware. I don't think I'm purchasing anything.
No, it's a euphemistic purchase.
A euphemistic purchasing. So the
Yeah.
consideration is I'm here and you're going to give me some information.
Well, I'm burning your time, aren't I? I hope it's worth
You
it.
don't sign the.
Do we have a
just
podium
sign the
up
fine.
No, but we have that little table.
So it's dash S. So it's around.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
there is some communication as Paul Shannon would put it.
To do is to make sure that it
Yes.
has squashing motion. Because it has to be everything.
What time did you get home last night?
I left early.
No, it's there.
Yeah, I left
Yeah. Whoops.
Oh, How the hell? There
Because
are two males
you're a
here.
squash and merge.
I left at about,
I have no idea.
what time I connected? About 9 o'clock, I think. I wasn't at the, function.
Here? Oh, wait a minute, I bet it goes here.
Yeah, it just.
Oh, no, that's just before you did it.
Well, it was not connected to
There,
that.
let's try this and see what
Yeah, I went to the main
Katrina, I
train.
think, went down to talk to you from Civic
So you got
Ledger.
that?
Sorry?
Katrina from Civic Ledger?
Yeah.
Did she get to you?
No?
Oh, but she's intending to catch up with you at the later.
Oh, okay.
That's insane.
Just a hello, I believe.
Yeah.
Well, no. If you push them up, would the sun?
Do we have to do something to turn this display on?
If it's not
No,
there,
it's got
it might be easier.
Is it in fire?
I reckon it'll work if I plug it in. It's just, it's too short. Oh, no, it isn't. That's actually connected to something else. That's a switch or something.
Yes.
Now, it's possible
No,
to
the way that we've got
connect
the set up is
this
that we have to
in
rewrite at most one.
to one of these.
Oh, yep, that's worked.
Something's happened to the screen.
Yeah, it's sort of bouncing around over there, so it thinks it's hooked to
Try Alt F5 on your machine.
The implementation.
It's a Mac.
Oh,
My Mac sees it, but
I mean,
this
this
is
is
displaying.
signed off, but this is signed off.
It's mirroring.
you need a Windows machine,
Yeah,
don't
so-
you know that?
I prefer not.
We require VCO for. VCO
It's
means.
mirroring for some reason. Here, let me turn mirroring off.
Whatever. Yeah.
Okay.
I would have thought that that would have been sorted for that already.
My machine sees it.
I think the way that effectively.
Alright, I think it's on the wrong input. So that should be HDMI.
Yeah,
Four.
just trying to see where we change the input.
Actually, if you want to swap, I can, because otherwise I can just move it physically to HDMI 1.
Why don't you move physically to HDMI? I am not
So if you have not and you force that through.
Oh,
This is one part of
I just moved it to 1.
Yeah, alright. Very business.
You have every
business.
able to check right for VCO, like to say, like VCO.
Yeah, Rob, go ahead.
No.
That's bad.
It's not displaying.
That what? Oh, he has it, has he?
Which was done previously by some developer.
Yeah.
Better off,
Right.
Lawyers got the whole
No, I'll just mirror it.
and you know,
That'll
you already able to actually have reorganize it in the interface of
Can't flood your reader.
rather than well, the copyright
That's endorsement,
basically explicitly signed off that it's going to be under this license. This license you can do this.
There you go.
It's grandson.
Yeah, I know.
You don't have a clicker, do you?
I know, it was my legs are not lying like this, so the confusion like
I need that bit you just lost.
And Mark Brannigan has got it.
You did well to do that.
That was a task and a half.
Must be good. Bring a crowd.
Oh, okay, well.
I feel like I'm lecturing at UQ, everybody's sitting in the back.
Sorry? What was that?
So I feel like I'm lecturing at UQ, everybody's sitting in the back.
Yeah.
That's because you are.
Are we gonna start
Just
this?
treat me as one of the Muppets in the
We're gonna
gallery.
start this?
Yeah, it's live.
Oh, it's live.
Red means it's on.
I'm live? Didn't I get a warning? Are you gonna introduce me or not?
Yeah, well, I should.
I can't wait to figure out who I am.
Yeah. Well, sorry, it has just been it's been a chaotic last quite a few days,
Yeah.
weeks.
Yes.
Anyway, we are here now, so it's all good. So hello and welcome everyone to the Ethereum Engineering Group meetup. So today we have David Hyland-Wood, who's going to tell us all about space stuff, but really it's IoT and blockchain, because you know what is a spacecraft? You know, a device, low memory, low CPU, out in the middle of nowhere.
Poor comms.
Poor comms.
Poor security.
Yeah, poor security, poor comms. Yeah, you know, messages may or may not get there. It feels very IoT-ish. So anyway, I'll hand it over to you, David.
Thanks, Peter. When we started this project back around, is Chris Hare here? No, he was. So this group of people and a few others. So Chris Lewicki's in Seattle, Washington. Chris Hare, I saw him earlier today. Oh, there he is. He snuck in moments after saying his name. I must have summoned you. Peter, of course, Roberto Saltini in Sydney, Sandra Johnson, Brett Henderson, who's here in Brisbane, is not here today, has also contributed to a different paper other than this one. But we've been beating around on these ideas because last year I was involved with Chris Lewicki doing an acquisition of a space company for Consensus. And so that's how we started talking about space-related things. We were interested to find out when we started talking to people and doing the research that it really is an IoT problem, right? A spacecraft is a robot with all of these issues, right? You can't physically upgrade it. Once you launch it, you send it out someplace, you're never going to touch it again. The work that was done to maintain the Hubble Space Telescope was tremendously expensive, and it was in low Earth orbit. Once you send something farther out, it's gone. And yet, you can look at some of these things like the Mars Curiosity rover, which in its first year of life had 0 hardware upgrades, and yet quite a number of software upgrades. And so you can touch the software on the things, but you're never going to be able to upgrade the CPU. You're never going to be able to upgrade the memory. You're going to have continuous communication problems. Often these things have been launched over the course of decades, and cybersecurity was never an issue because there were very few ground stations that could be built by governments at great expense to talk to some remote spacecraft. All of a sudden this year, we're talking about putting spacecraft that already exist onto existing 5G networks, and the cybersecurity is not ready. So how do we deal with that? Right? And the answer is the only thing that we can touch is the software, and yet we're stuck with these old computing capabilities. Or even with the new spacecraft, they're still limited in terms of power. They're still limited in terms of compute capability. They're still limited in terms of comms. They're still limited in terms of heat rejection. Rejecting heat into a vacuum turns out to be hard. Right? So if you look at the International Space Station, it's got these big solar panels on it. Then there are these other big things that are bigger at 90 degrees to the solar panels. Big gray things, big gray panels. Those are heat radiators. Those are trying to dump the waste heat out of the spacecraft into the vacuum. And it's very, very challenging to do that. Heat rejection is a big deal on spacecraft. So running something like an intensive piece of software that's going to burn a lot of CPU time, generate a lot of heat, is going to be a very difficult thing to do. All right, so little scene setting. This looks really futuristic, huh? Because it's blue, and the future is blue. You ever notice it? But this picture is actually years old. This is taken from the International Space Station looking over the Midwest of the United States at night. And so as futuristic as this looks, it's already old. When we think of the future, we inherently think about space. Our visions of the future are inherently about space exploration, going exploratory species. We do this stuff almost intrinsically. It's part of who we are. So right now we've got a lot of talk about returning to the moon. This is NASA's, or the International Lunar Gateway concept that's being built now by a series of international partners. Think of the International Space Station orbiting the moon instead of Earth, and it's a little smaller. So quite a bit smaller, actually. And on to Mars. A lot of Mars concepts coming out. This one, you look at stuff like this and you say, oh, is that some blogger's conception of what a Martian colony looks like? This actually came from NASA Ames Research Center. So, very serious people are conceiving how we're going to move humans into space on a permanent basis, and maybe even farther out. Right? Space habitats of one form or another around different planets, on different planets, around orbiting bodies of asteroids or moons. but they're not all people. Robots have preceded us into space everywhere we've gone. Every planet in our solar system now, including as of last year Pluto, if you want to call it a planet. It's actually, the International Astronomical Union calls it a dwarf planet because it's no longer considered to have planetary status. But spacecraft, automated spacecraft, robots that we communicate with, have gone to every planet in the solar system. We've only gone to one, ours. We've only sent human beings as far as the moon, and no human being has been on the moon since 1972. Everything else since then has been in low Earth orbit. So if you think about low Earth orbit, imagine the Earth is the size of a peach. Low Earth orbit, as far as humans have been since 1972, is like skimming the surface of a fuzz on that peach. That's pretty much staying in the neighborhood. So in that time, we've been learning how to operate in space with the International Space Station. We've been preparing to go to the moon, preparing to go to Mars, doing a lot of science. But the real exploration work that's being done to the asteroid belt, to the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, to the outer planets, now with Voyager missions that were launched in the 70s actually having left the solar system, all of this work is being done by semi-autonomous spacecraft. Robots that we've built, that we've sent out, that really don't care if they're operating on their own for years at a time. Human beings tend to get annoyed by that. So, how do we operate these spacecraft more efficiently? How do we do things with robotic spacecraft? The answer there is also software. We can touch the software, we can't touch the hardware once it's gone. So if we look at how spacecraft communicate with us, we've always done this. We send a spacecraft out and we talk to it from Earth, from a ground station. In the last few decades, we've begun relaying information via spacecraft back to Earth. So we have landers on Mars right now, and they talk to spacecraft in Martian orbit that then talk to the Earth. We're beginning to operate the earliest of spacecraft swarms. Many spacecraft that share the same relay. And as of this year, we have spacecraft being launched by OneWeb and by SpaceX for their Starlink constellation, which both systems are to provide global internet coverage. And those spacecraft talk to each other in relay down to Earth as well. And so we're beginning to see spacecraft talking to each other as a normal and natural part of their operations. Those conversations right now are pretty scripted. They're protocol based, just like web server to web server, web server to database, client, web client to web server. They're scripted protocols. They may have quite a vocabulary, quite a large series of APIs on which they can draw, but they're fairly scripted. They're predefined protocols. Now this is very different from what we really conceive of when we think of artificial intelligence, right? A self-driving car makes a lot of decisions as it drives down the road. Similarly, our spacecraft that are currently, landers that are currently exploring on the moon and on Mars, they also make a lot of autonomous decisions. And they communicate with Earth for their more general requirements, right? Generally, where do you want me to go? Okay, I know how to get there, right? So that degree of autonomy that these robots have is increasing over time. And as that degree of autonomy increases, the complexity of these communications both increases and decreases. It increases in that the spacecraft is doing its own thing and it's reporting what it's doing. It decreases in that it has to communicate less because it needs to get direction less. So what do we do if we send up 2 robots and they're actually owned by different people? They're owned by different countries, right? The US sends up a spacecraft, India sends up a spacecraft, or China, or Russia, or Australia, or whoever else. Right now, we don't do this. Spacecraft launched by one country only talks to spacecraft by that country. But this is coming. This is a logical next step in the process. To do this, we have to have international standards. Standards team, right? We have to have protocols like HTTP that are utterly ubiquitous. We need to have an understanding by an AI system how to speak at the hardware level to another spacecraft with the right radio frequencies, the right encodings, the right protocols, the right vocabulary, the right APIs, in order to be able to communicate spacecraft to spacecraft in some high level of abstraction. To make matters even worse, maybe it's not 2 countries that can coordinate together at the UN, but maybe one of those spacecraft is owned by a private company. That's SpaceX's logo, if anybody doesn't recognize it. Right? And so here again, we have an increasing need for both intelligence, artificial intelligence at the spacecraft, and a need for a greater degree of autonomy in the spacecraft, and a need for international standards and capabilities to allow these communications to be formed in an ad hoc manner as they become needed. Why do we need spacecraft to talk to each other at all? Well, it turns out space is big. It's really big, to quote Douglas Adams. So if we look just within the asteroid belt, just from one side of this mess to another, just the light speed delay alone from one side of the asteroid belt to the other, you're talking about an hour? More? Each way? And so when we start looking at the communications delays, not to mention the fact that, you know, if you've got something exactly on the other side of the sun, you can't talk to it anyway without a relay. If you're on the wrong side of a planet or an asteroid, your communications line of sight is disrupted. Right? Your ground station on Earth turns as the Earth turns, which is why we need ground stations all over the planet. If we have a ground station on Mars, we may not have full coverage all day long. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of geometry. Everything's going around, everything's moving. Distances are huge. Light speed is not something, science fiction aside, that we're going to get around anytime soon, if at all. Theoretically, our best knowledge of physics say that is an unbreakable problem. And one of the problems that we have with science fiction is that the first thing a science fiction writer does is ignores that problem for storytelling purposes. But the actual story that we're actually writing about our own actual future, we don't have that option. We have to live with these and work around these and design for these very real limitations. So we need to start conceiving of that, how we do that. So if we look at a spacecraft or 2 spacecraft out at the asteroid belt, just trying to get a message to Earth might be a half an hour each way. Now think about current blockchain consensus protocols. Let's say that these 2 spacecraft are blockchain clients, or let's say they're wallets, space wallets, or they're some kind of, they're trying to do a transaction between each other, right? So an asteroid prospector has prospected some water. The other spacecraft needs to refuel. And so it could use that hydrogen and that oxygen as rocket propellant. And they would like to conduct a transaction between them, an economic transaction. One has something to sell, one has something to buy. How do they do that? Well, using current technologies and our current conception of distributed computing, if a message is going to take a half an hour each way and it's all going to go via Earth, right? The consensus formulation alone is going to take days. Meanwhile, these things exist in a hard radiation environment. Meanwhile, that they may need that fuel very rapidly. Meanwhile, this prospector might need to get on with its other job, right? So using computing resources in this environment as if you have them to burn, as if you've got a lot of time to waste, as if you've got a lot of power to waste, is not on. That's not how this situation would play out well at all. So those are design criteria that we should start thinking about. What can we do in distributed computing sense to ease these kind of problems, to allow these things to operate more autonomously? Well, when we looked at the space domain just within the asteroid belt, not out to other stars or out to the outer solar system, just within the inner solar system, we could really think quickly about three domains of operations. When we talk about cislunar space, we mean within the orbit of the moon, or Mars's moon, Deimos, so cis-demotic space within the orbit of Mars. And I apologize to the lawyer in the room because those are Greek roots, not Latin.
I forgive you.
I appreciate it. So within cislunar space, within the orbit of the moon, time delays aren't bad, right? You get seconds or minutes maybe, and it's okay. We can live with that. We can use and do use classic distributed computing within that realm. Between planets, interplanetary space, well, Mars is sometimes pretty close to the Earth when they're both on the same side of the sun. And when they're on opposite sides of the sun, they're pretty far away. And it's about a 2-year cycle. So there are issues where sometimes this communication is reasonably quick and sometimes it's pretty slow. And so we need some resilience in our protocols to deal with that kind of flexible timing. We might probably want to be in an environment where timeouts are not how we conduct our protocols. Almost all of our distributed computing protocols right now rely on timeouts for error handling. Well, if you can't rely on timeouts, you need to choose protocols or invent protocols that can be used for asynchronous networks, where time is not a factor. You're not relying on time to manage your error conditions. When you're out in the beyond the planetary, metaplanetary space, out in the asteroid belt or further out, it would really be optimal if you could conduct transactions out here right between spacecraft and then report the results. In other words, allow these things to operate very autonomously because the time delays just get too long. So do we have any kind of technology to do this? The answer is yeah, conceptually we do. Blockchains are great at doing cross-jurisdictional exchange. It was one of the primary use cases for Bitcoin, cross-jurisdictional exchange. Parties don't have to know each other. They don't have to trust each other. You can transfer Bitcoin between two entities, whether those entities are robots or people or banks or what have you. They don't have to know each other. They don't have to trust each other. This system allows for that. So that begins to look like a good property for this sort of thing. We can create generalized markets with blockchains. That's great. However, we also know that the current generation of blockchain protocols have some real disadvantages, right? Bitcoin proof of work is a hungry beast. I think the thing that really points that out in my mind is the fact that in Western China there was an entire Bitcoin mining farm built with ASICs in conjunction with a coal-fired power plant, 30 megawatt coal-fired power plant, solely for the purpose of providing electrical power to it. right? From a global warming perspective, this is what we call a bad thing. But from an economics perspective, it actually made sense for them to build that because we provided an economic incentive for them to burn that much power. One of the primary use cases for Ethereum was to change the proof of work algorithm to avoid the incentive to use ASICs, right? For that purpose, for that reason. So we still have a lot of issues here about using blockchains, but they, at the high level, they kind of look right. Now, lots of people are talking about how to use blockchains in space. If we look around the world, we see the China National Space Agency, Roscosmos, the Russian Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese, ISRO, the Indians, NASA, ESA in Europe. All these people all over the world looking at how to use blockchains for some kind of space applications. And they all say the same thing. They all say, hey, in concept, this stuff solves a lot of problems. In practice, our knowledge of distributed computing causes other problems that we now have as engineering constraints we need to solve. Right? But look at the kind of things that we're trying to do here, right? Identity management, protection against cyber attacks. That's another talk that I'll be giving here in late November, November 27th.
Oh yeah, it
Yep.
is November, yep.
So we'll talk later about, at this meetup, about how to use blockchains to secure communication channels. So communication state integrity and security. This is an interesting one. This guy Mandel is at NASA, and he was talking about how to do space traffic management. Imagine you've got a bunch of satellites operated by a bunch of different countries, companies, agencies around the world, and you've got a high-level requirement. I would like to take photographs in several different parts of the electrodynamic spectrum of Brisbane at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning, or between, say, 10 and midday. And I don't care which spacecraft gives me those photos. I just want the images. Maybe I want. But I could write a smart contract with that requirement, and I could put it on a blockchain. And different spacecraft, when they're going around in their orbit, can look at all of the different requirements that people have posted for imagery, and they know their orbits, and they can say to themselves, yeah, I'm not going to be in the right spot for that. Or I could satisfy part of that requirement. So let's say you've got a spacecraft that's going to be passing overhead Brisbane Tuesday morning at an appropriate angle, and it has an infrared sensor on it, but it doesn't have a visible camera. It can say, oh, I could provide the infrared portion of that smart contract requirement. And so it does. Some other spacecraft provides the visual image portion of that smart contract requirement. So you get spacecraft coordinating or cooperating without the need for them to coordinate. The spacecraft don't know each other. They don't talk to each other, but they're both interacting with the smart contract on the blockchain. That's Mandel's conception at NASA on how to do coordination in low Earth orbit between spacecraft. Well, that's a good idea. We ought to do that. We ought to do more than that. We ought to keep carrying that conception forward and extending it beyond low Earth orbit. That's a good idea. So what kind of information architectures can we have? Well, at a very high level, there are four. A spacecraft can be a regular blockchain node. It can be a mining node or validating node. It can only read from the blockchain, or it can also write to the blockchain or request a write to the blockchain. So we can begin to conceive of what are the limitations against these information architectures. Which ones do we want in those various domains? So how does this help us get two robots in the outer solar system to coordinate with each other? We have this idea from way back, which Adrian will know well, the concept of Lex Mercatoria. back in the age of discovery, when ships from Europe were going all over the world, they would meet up often on the far side of the planet, and the countries they were sent from might be at peace, they might be at war. They might have tensions, they might be friendly. They might be interacting with the governments of the foreign lands in which they were in. There might not be formal governments in the lands in which they're in. But those people need food. They need water, they might need shelter, they might need spare parts. They had to live for years on the far side of the planet, away from their home and their legal jurisdiction. And how do they do that? Well, what they did is they found themselves needing to help each other on the far side of the world, and sometimes interoperate beyond the realm of their government, beyond the realm of their country's legal jurisdiction systems. Now, this became known over time as Lex Mercatoria, which is a Latin term. It means merchant law. In other words, the merchants were conducting their own system of economics and law, and had courts and had contracts. Matter of fact, our concept of the written contract came from these people doing these things. Now, a lot's been made about Lex Mercatoria, and some people will tell you, some scholars will tell you, there was no such system. What there really was, I think, from my reading, is there was a system of systems. These people individually filled gaps where they needed to fill gaps. And so it was never a single court system, a single written code of conduct, but it was a bunch of people needing to get along and needing to work things out. And we can take many of the conceptions of Lex Mercatoria and we can move those forward into some, by analogy, into this new world of space. So this concept of the writing obligatory, the written contract, was a key bit of it. Also, this self-organization was an important bit of it. And so all of this supported party autonomy, this new age of discovery out in space, and we can use some of these concepts. What does that look like? Well, it kind of looks like this. We know that blockchains can be used to exchange tokens for goods and services. We legal contracts in some cases, with a lot of caveats. We know that blockchains provide auditability, finality. There's an ability to review that stuff, to see what you agreed to, either beforehand or post facto. And we do have some issues that are different. How do you resolve disputes? Well, back in the Lex Mercatoria days, there were merchant courts set up to deal with disputes, because guess what? Some people aren't honest. I think you can suggest that some spacecraft that are programmed by people will also not be honest. That would be entirely consistent with the entire history of the human race.
There's a lot of built-in bias.
Well, rather, even if it's unintentional,
Yeah.
right? You can act as some catch up on what a blockchain is. Maybe it'll come. In some cases, there's already law that might provide for contract dispute, regardless of how it's technically implemented, and we can show that you agreed to it, and your opportunity for dispute is lessened. Now, back here at home, we've got all kinds of law that allow you to go to court and deal with disputes. Out in space, we have to presume there's going to be a phase of the Wild West. We will see any of the properties that allow us to conduct economic transactions between widely distributed spacecraft that can operate semi-autonomously or autonomously. So what kind of blockchain do we want? Well, this is out of a paper here called, by Verst and Gervais, called Do You Need a Blockchain? Now, there are a lot of these. There are a lot of flowcharts about what kind of blockchain do you need. This was one of the early ones, and I think it's one of the best ones. CSIRO has another paper that we've cited here Their flowchart's a little more complicated, and I'm not sure it covers a couple of things that this does. So I'll just walk through this one. If we look at it, probably with spacecraft, we're looking for something like this. We probably do need to store state. We definitely have multiple writers. We might be able to actually have a trusted third party. With spacecraft, they're always controlled by somebody. We could interoperate between only NASA spacecraft, and NASA would be the trusted third party. NASA and the ESA have all kinds of governing operations between each other, and Roscosmos, for that matter, and JAXA, and some of these other national space agencies. With SpaceX right now, they have contracts with NASA, but for the rest of the world, maybe there's a gap there. But it's entirely conceivable. There are so few spacefaring nations, there are so few spacefaring companies, that maybe they could set up a trusted third party and operate. But here's the thing. We already know that even today, geopolitics ensures that there are cybersecurity attacks against networks that control spacecraft. So China, even though this is recorded and live streamed, China was caught red-handed breaking into NASA JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. And they got access successfully to networks that controlled deep space probes, networks that controlled spacecraft. So one of the driving factors there is to recognize that our cybersecurity is a problem internationally because it is another form of diplomacy, of warfare, of competition between nations. The incentives are so high to do this that of course people do this. So one way to secure those networks is to have perfect networks where all the software so harden your networks that never happens. Now, if anybody ever knows of such a system, I think they'd like to point it out to me because I've never seen one in my 35 years in this industry. So I think more likely we need to recognize that we're always going to be operating on insecure networks, and we need to be taking the kind of cybersecurity preparation that we take on these networks. GitHub knows it has bugs. So what does it do when I log in? There's a multi-factor authentication call. We can do that with Spacecraft 2. We can do multi-party authorization, sometimes with humans in the loop, sometimes with machines in the loop, sometimes with both. We can make these things arbitrarily complicated, so even if certain accounts are compromised, it doesn't give you control over a spacecraft. We can require a lot of cooperation and coordination before things happen in order to do that. So I would argue that in the space realm, because there's so much software involved, because the software is too complicated to secure properly, that we should treat these trusted third parties as not trusted. We should recognize that cybersecurity issues alone ensure that even though there are third parties, we should treat them as non-trusted. So we probably do know this fairly small number of spacecraft involved, who the writers are. We probably don't want to trust the writers for the same cybersecurity reasons. We don't want to trust the third party. We probably, we might want public verifiability, but we probably don't. And so that puts us in this realm of a private permission blockchain. That's probably where we're going to end up, and that's the rough evolving consensus among space people on blockchain use. So what does this look like? Well, I can think of three scenarios quickly. One is two parties agree in advance on what the contract terms are, and they write a smart contract. So this is a pre-existing agreement. Biggest companies in the US, Boeing and Lockheed Martin, have said that anybody who wants to provide rocket fuel to them out on some asteroid, they put a spot price on that. That's a pre-existing agreement. Encoding that pre-existing agreement on a smart contract on a blockchain, that's a no-brainer. That's step one. We can do that. What might we do in advance of that? Well, say a contract is written by one party who knows who's capable of fulfilling it. That's a directed request, economic terms. Right? So I say, Michelle, I would gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Right? And I want you to provide it for me. And you can agree or disagree. It's your choice. Right? Now, if you say no, well, I don't get my hamburger. Right? That's different from saying it to the room. Hey, anybody, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Right? Anybody want to give me a hamburger? Okay? Well, Stefan says no. Somebody might say yes. I might get lucky. Right? But if I did the latter, if I put out a generalized market request, a contract is written for anyone, for fulfillment by anyone, right? That's a generalized market. I just have something to buy, somebody else has something to sell. Anybody, anytime you can come to an agreement, you've got a deal. So eBay is a generalized market in that sense, right? Amazon, etc. So we can do that, and we can write contracts like this, and this is where Mandel was going with this conception of, hey, I'll write high-level contracts for spacecraft requirements, imaging requirements. And it doesn't matter who fulfills them, right? I'll pay whoever fulfills a portion of that contract or the entire contract. So in this case, imagine we go back to our asteroid example here. So some mining spacecraft finds oxygen on a asteroid, uses electrolysis from electricity to separate hydrogen and oxygen. Now you've made liquid rocket fuel. This is the very basis for liquid rocket fuel. You get cryogenic hydrogen, cryogenic oxygen. Turns out that being cryogenic in the outer reaches of the solar system is not hard. You don't need a refrigeration unit. So life is good. So there's a seller who says, oh, very good, there is now a market for this. We're ready to buy. We will pay for that fuel. There might be a trade, right? This spacecraft might have imaging data. It might have sensor data of some form that it might trade as part of that deal. And how that payment is made, whether that payment is made in a stable coin, whether it's made in a cryptocurrency that's not stable, whether it's a trade of data for physical objects, etc., it doesn't matter. It's a generalized market at that point. So how do we do consensus? I said that distributed computing has all these holes in it for a distributed IoT environment, much less for a distributed IoT environment in space. We have all these power issues, computation issues, communication issues, heat rejection issues. Well, this is what we came up with so far. Inside the orbit of the moon, right, near some planetary body, we probably want to use blockchains to foster communication security and interoperability at the transaction level. We can use timeouts because the time horizons, the light speed delays are not particularly relevant. We certainly have partially synchronous networks. We do not have synchronous networks. These are not guaranteed networks operating at a rapid speed inside a bank's data center. All the communication here is radio-based or maybe laser-based. So optical communications or radio communications. In either case, it's electromagnetic spectrum communications. So that means you're going to have jamming. You're going to have blackouts. You're going to have occultation due to planetary alignments. You're going to have all this kind of stuff. We absolutely want Byzantine fault tolerance because these are expensive assets. And we want immediate finality. Well, with that list of engineering criteria, we can choose an existing consensus mechanism, and I've got a slide on that in a minute. Right? So that problem is solvable, close to the Earth. You can imagine in a future Mars colony or Moon colony, solvable in that context as well. Now interplanetary, say between Earth and Mars, now we want some generalized common market to exist. where the transaction volumes are originally going to be quite low. Hopefully they increase over time. But we absolutely have asynchronous networks. We absolutely want Byzantine fault tolerance. We almost assuredly want immediate finality. And so now we've got a totally different set of engineering criteria. This is also possible with current technology, but it really limits your options. Right? Something like Paula would work here. But we need to probably work on designing better consensus algorithms for blockchains in this environment. Now, when you go right out, now we probably want autonomously negotiated transactions between spacecraft without having to check on Earth. We want those transactions to be final before they get to us. And now you want provable transactions before serialization. We are not prepared to do that today. We have invention to do to get there. But the advances in artificial intelligence, as well as the advances in spacecraft, mean that this is absolutely coming. So within cislunar space, we want some kind of proof of authority mechanism here. IBFT2, implemented in Pantheon now Besu, is our preferred solution to this. There's a reason. I've got a slide in a moment. Interplanetary, probably a hybrid approach. Maybe Honey Badger, maybe Paula, something along that line. Something that's going to work in an asynchronous environment. And metaplanetary, and those things will be locally finalized and then later serialized to an asynchronous network. That's probably the environment we're looking at for this domain. So if we look at various proofs of authority consensus algorithms, you can see that they all have the same order of magnitude message traffic. Or at least if not the same order of magnitude, they're in the same domain. They all vary with the square of the number of nodes on the network. The change needed to the onboard software is going to be a function, maybe a large function, but a function of the block sizes, which, you know, for small traffic networks might be quite low. But then look at this last column, resilience to lost messages. Well, of these, IBFT and IBFT2 provide that, but IBFT has been shown not to be Byzantine fault tolerant in partially synchronous networks. And IBFT2 has been proven to be BFT tolerant in partially synchronous networks. And so what we want here is that. Now we also considered Algorand because it is a POA algorithm, and it has immediate finality in many cases, but it has some fallback conditions in which it's not, it only has probabilistic finality. And that's why we cut it out of this analysis. Now if we look at if you think back to that slide on possible information architectures, if we start operating blockchain nodes on spacecraft, well, you've got a lot of message traffic and you've got a lot of software changes necessary. The sweet spot here, the easy thing to do, is to make these things read from a blockchain. And if you can solve your use case, which you can in most of the orbital scenarios, you know, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, high Earth orbit, those environments around Earth, then doing something like this probably makes a lot of sense, because you can do that with moderate changes or low changes to the software on board existing spacecraft. And you can do it in a way that doesn't require a lot of computation on board the spacecraft. So this would be a spacecraft operating with a terrestrial blockchain, so acting as a wallet, right, or using an API against a terrestrial blockchain. So this is the basis for our multi-factor authentication, multi-party authorization system that I'll be talking about at the end of November. Now, you can imagine in the future, when we start going out in those outer domains, you're just going to have, get a gaming machine, the heatsink is, many orders of magnitude times the size of the CPU. So we will continue to have heat rejection problems, which means we will need bigger spacecraft. We will continue to have communications issues. We will have more and more software running on those things. To some degree, that's just expected, but it is a cost we're going to have to bear. So that's me. Are there any questions? Rob?
You mentioned the early spacecraft had limited cyber defense sort of, I guess, planning going into the software on all those vehicles. Are you aware of any instances where foreign or different parties other than the person launching that satellite has actually tried to take control of that vehicle or interfere with that vehicle?
Right. So the question was, are there any actual historical examples of successful cyber attacks against spacecraft? And the answer is yes. Unsurprisingly, governments and corporations that control spacecraft are very reluctant to talk about this. But I did find 2 instances in public record because of U.S. government transparency laws, which are very different in, say, China or Russia or India. But in the U.S., there are transparency laws that require certain types of reporting. And so the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA JPL, publicly needed to acknowledge in a cybersecurity audit by NASA that they had been hacked, and there was a successful cyber attack. Actually, there were 2 successful cyber attacks from a foreign government against the networks that control their spacecraft. That was one. That was about a decade ago. Now, a little shorter time ago, one of the U.S. Air Force's senior people announced publicly that they had active cyber attacks against some of their spacecraft using commercially available software. And this was a big deal because I don't know how intentional that particular admission was, but it was an interesting one. And when you really think about cyber attacks, think of it just like the internet. You really have 2 types of attacks. You get some kind of denial of service, right? Which in spacecraft terms is just jamming. Someone will overpower the radio signals so that their signal is going to dominate over yours, and that might be quite advanced. In which case, it's known as electronic warfare, right? Or it might be quite even unintentional, where somebody is just broadcasting on a frequency that you're using against international agreement, pirate radio, say, or whatever. So jamming is the way that you conduct a denial of service attack when your communications mechanism is some kind of EM-based, right, communication. Now the second is some kind of active hacking attempt. You're trying to log into the satellite and give it a command, right? And that has occurred in these cases, and the multi-factor authentication, multi-party authorization technique that we came up with, we'll be presenting that at a conference in Okinawa next month, at the end of the month, the International Conference on Spacecraft Systems and Communications. And we were invited to present that paper because we had a solution to that problem. And it's a big deal because most of the spacecraft, most of the geostationary communications satellites operated by Telstra and Optus and telecommunications companies around the world, their cybersecurity is pretty spotty. A lot of the government stuff, NASA really only started providing reasonable cybersecurity to its deep space probes in recent years. The older ones, there just weren't any. The U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy was pretty good about it. Russian and Chinese government spy satellites and stuff were pretty good about it. There's all kinds of stuff out there that's not. If you go look online, you'll see that there's open source software, for example, to connect to software-defined radios and just decode messages that people are sending to each other over the Iridium satellite network. And there are other networks like this. You can pull down Landsat images. You can decode people's fax messages, text messages, pager messages. The Iridium stuff, you'll hear 911 calls, emergency calls going over. You can just monitor all kinds of stuff because it's not encrypted. The command channels on those spacecraft, even spacecraft that are being sent up today, you get CubeSat launches, small spacecraft launches, with such spotty ComSec that maybe their data is completely unencrypted that they're providing down, and their command channel is only basically an SSL link with a simple username password, or maybe not even that. And so this didn't used to be a big deal because there were very few satellite ground stations in the world. But now there are commercial ground station as a service offerings from several companies. And Amazon earlier this year announced a ground station as a service offering, so you can go to your AWS account and pay by the hour for access to satellite ground stations and talk to whatever satellite that you can talk to. Well, that makes communication security suddenly an issue. I know everyone wants to try it now, right? Yeah. Start with the Iridium code. You just run it on Linux and listen to the Iridium conversations. It's really fascinating. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
What's the current legal understanding in space? Is there actually a legal system that governs things like that, or not so much?
There are a series of international treaties, and Adrian, you might know more than I do. If you do, please jump in.
Yeah, there are a number of treaties at the present moment. It's meant to be lots of land on the moon.
Nobody thinks that's legit, by the way.
Yeah.
But it's made the man $2 million.
Oh, he's a very wealthy man from idiots that for $29 you can own, I think, a hectare.
Right.
But the problem is he's sold the same hectare multiple times. Which is,
from the US, Russia, China, and India have all caused a lot of space debris.
Well,
and that's obviously problematic.
And these satellites run into it.
Yeah.
And damages it and can't be used again. So there's a treaty dealing with basically warfare in attacking other satellites. I think there's also a treaty on when you can actually shoot up a satellite, covering those particular issues.
So the 1967 Outer Space Treaty is the one that Adrian was talking about, which says, we kind of want to treat the moon similar to Antarctica. We don't want to, right? The goal originally was don't weaponize space, but that actually never made it into the treaty. And not all potential spacefaring nations, and these days not all spacefaring nations have signed up to that treaty. There was a later one in the early 70s, 72, I think, and the United States didn't ratify that one. And so the different countries that did or did not ratify those treaties, the whole thing becomes quite complicated. Right now, an interesting one, you may or may not know about this, an interesting one is that the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, actually licenses orbital slots in geosynchronous orbit. So this is a very special orbit where the speed of the orbit happens to match the rotation speed of the Earth. So a satellite that's right over the equator looks like it always stays in the same spot overhead as it goes around the Earth. This is obviously used for things like telecommunications satellites because it's really convenient to know exactly where your satellite is and have it be in communication with you all the time. So if you want to do something like broadcast TV or internet or whatever, that's super convenient. Optus and Telstra and communications companies, they do that. It's such a popular orbit that it's become crowded. So the IT now it's so crowded that when a spacecraft is about to die, when it's out of fuel, or it's damaged or it's ending its life, it's supposed to move into a higher orbit, so-called graveyard orbit, to free up that slot so the ITU can license that slot to somebody else. Well, they didn't used to do that, so there's a lot of dead spacecraft in that orbit. Now that they do it, most parties are pretty well behaved, except what if your spacecraft just dies due to a technical glitch and you can't move it out of that highly valuable orbit, right? Before, its end of life happens before you intend. Well, now you've got a dead spacecraft in that valuable slot, right? And that stuff is building up over time. And you can imagine that the slots that are right over, say, the Americas or Europe or Japan, China, those bits of the orbit are becoming quite crowded. So this is a big problem. In other orbits, this is the bit you may not know. In other orbits, it's possible for a company, say SpaceX with its Starlink constellation, they want to send up a couple of thousand satellites in a given orbit. Now, if they do that, that orbital shell, right, kind of a spheroid bigger than the Earth at a certain altitude, a couple of thousand satellites, they're going to have a de facto monopoly of that orbital shell because nobody else can put up satellites in that orbit because it's too crowded. They'll hit each other. Now, they've already launched the first 60 satellites up there, and they've got thousands more to go. And so there was a paper by an Aussie, 3 Aussies actually, a lawyer and 2 space engineers, or a space physicist and a space engineer, one of whom is my friend Patty Neumann down in Adelaide. And they wrote about this before Starlink launched and then effectively did what he was warning against, which is this de facto monopoly of a shell. And because it's not that special geosynchronous orbit, the ITU doesn't regulate it. So right now, it's the Wild West. Anybody can put up a satellite in an orbit and they're responsible for not hitting somebody else's satellite. And that system cannot stand the test of time. If you were to Google space debris, you would see that there have been conferences and proposals and startup companies and government-funded research and all kinds of stuff for decades to address this problem. But it's kind of like climate change. We've known about it for ages and we have not taken adequate action on it.
One of the particularly fun ones about cleaning up space debris is that we don't have a law of salvage. So you can't your satellite
Territory of the country that launched them, and it's complicated, right? If they're a government spacecraft, that would be an act of war. If it's a commercial spacecraft, there would certainly be a court case over it, a complaint about it, because even if it's dead, it's still valuable intellectual property, for example. And there are a number of proposals now, including blockchain-based proposals, to try to get smart contracts or other kinds of traditional contracts in place to allow space debris to be cleaned up, so that you can do things like clear a valuable orbital slot that has a monetary value already attached to it. There are also attempts to get agreement from people who own dead satellites to allow their stuff to be cleaned up if the technology becomes available to clean it up.
Yeah, there's a thing called the doctrine of abandonment, which occurs really there's been about 25 cases on the Titanic, because it's in international waters.
Right.
Has the company, which still, White Line, I think was
A West Star Line.
West Star Line, yeah. Have they abandoned that ship? Admittedly, it's 7 kilometres in the bottom of the ocean. Very hard to actually recover.
But on the high seas, we have salvage rights. And in space, currently my understanding is we don't.
No, that's true. But the issue comes back is that the jurisdiction that sent it up hasn't abandoned that property.
That's right.
And it would be very hard to create salvage rights if they argue that they haven't abandoned it.
And we have seen examples of catastrophic failure due to collision. If you're in orbit, you're moving at many kilometers per second. Okay? This is what's known as a collision between a Russian satellite risk of these two satellites. One was being launched in a transfer orbit, it was passing the orbit of another, 7, 10, 12, 15 kilometers a second more. And sooner or later, it hits stuff. The International Space Station maneuvers all the time to avoid space debris. And it's not like once a year or once a month. It's like sometimes several times a week, even a couple times a day.
They have armored plating on the windows for that reason.
Yes, that, and also for radiation protection for the crew. Yeah, but they've seen quite a number of micrometeoroid impacts on the space station, and sometimes have to repair them.
The shuttle had a paint speck here.
Yep. Yes, one of the shuttles, Endeavour, I think maybe had a chunk taken out of its windscreen.
Yeah.
That would,
I think.
yeah, that would have been scary as hell.
So how do they coordinate different orbit paths between organizations that don't necessarily want the other person to know that the satellite is? Does that
Poorly.
happen? Yeah?
Yeah, they do talk to each other. Operators of spacecraft are constantly in discussion with other spacecraft operators, but it's not a scalable solution. One of the problems we have is it's really hard to tell exactly where a spacecraft is in relation to another. It's not like they have onboard sensors designed for collision avoidance, right? They're just robots up there with their own sensors, their own radios, doing their own job, and they're not designed to sense other spacecraft near them. They are able to maneuver. And so when you take telescopes and you look up and you try to plot, or radars, and you try to plot where all these spacecraft are, what you end up with is, well, it's probably here in this area. And then you got another spacecraft that you know that's probably here in this area. And maybe there's some overlap between those probabilistic areas. Right? And so they can't say for sure that spacecraft's going to pass this spacecraft with 50 meters between them. It's not how it works. And so operators of spacecraft, when they're multi-$100-million assets, and there's a possibility of collision based on the models and the observations, those operators are constantly talking to each other and making judgment calls on a daily basis of whether or not to expend propellant to maneuver to increase the distance between them. And that's expensive in terms of continual observations and communication between people and spacecraft operators having to be at the ground stations, right, and coordinating with each other. And often these things, because they're moving so fast, and because the observations are time delayed and such, there's a lot of concern right now that some of these near misses that have occurred, or some of these collisions that have actually occurred, were due to the fact that human operators just didn't have the information they needed. They didn't have the time to deal with it. They misread the priorities. It's not a scalable solution. As we put up more spacecraft every single month, this issue has really come to a head. We need a better system, and we don't have it yet. So when I say that, how do they coordinate poorly? It's not a joke. It's unfortunately the truth.
We should go to the next slide.
We should. Let's do that. So here are the next talks. Peter, do you want to go?
Yeah, I will. So next week, or in 2 weeks' time, in a fortnight, I'm going to talk about threshold signatures. So essentially, how do you have a M of N, so say 3 or 5 people combine to sign something, and how does that work? And this technology for the people involved in Hyperledger Besu is particularly important because it's used all through the cross-chain communications technology that's going into the product in the coming quarter or two. And then in a month's time, I'm going to talk about Hyperledger Vessu and Pegasus Plus. And so why did we go to Hyperledger? Why did we go from Pantheon to Hyperledger? What's in it? What's it all about? How do you interact with us in the Vessu space? And what's Pegasus Plus? What's it going to give you? How does that work? How does it relate? Babu is going to come up from his PhD at Griffith University on the Gold Coast, and he's going to talk about blockchain digital assets, which is his area of study. Horacio Majal, he's going to come along and talk about Hyperledger Vessu plugins. So in particular, if you wanted to write your own precompile or your own RPC call, how do you do that? What does that look like? And just walk us all through that. Then, as David said, he's going to talk about the IoT two-factor authentication mechanism that, or mainly him, that we've come up with, which I think is pretty groundbreaking. So that is going to be good. And then right at the end of the year, our last talk of the year, I'm going to talk about Ethereum reorgs, forks, and selfish mining, and other stuff related to that. And how does that all work? What does it all mean? And then we'll have a break for the end of the year. And of course, for this the October the 16th talk, if any of you Hyperledger Vessu people want to say, hey, actually, I'd like to do that talk, then I'm sure we can someone else can do it, or we can cooperate on doing it, or however we want to do it. It's all good. So anyway, thank you everyone for coming along, and thank you, David, for a fantastic talk. Very much. Okay, see you all later.